Well, greetings on the start of our fourth week. Can you believe it? We're almost halfway through this first course of 2327 Mexican American History. And I wanted to take a little more extended time here to try to kind of summarize what we've been hopefully learning so far. I would like to note that things are going on in Mexican American history and at NTCC, and you're invited to a special program. You probably can't see this very well, but um, we have a special um, presentation of Mexican American identity, a film that the honor students worked on last summer. This won't be this Friday, it will be next Friday, the 20th of February at 7 o'clock in the evening. Free refreshments, cookies baked by Mrs. Yax, and I will add 10 points to your exam score, 20 points if it's better for any one of the homework scores and the quiz or any low score you might have. One of the two. I add as extra credit if you would like to show your patriotism to Mexican American history. Actually, the story is going to concern more the second part of Mexican American history, if you're still with me in the second 8 weeks. It concerns Mexican American identity in San Antonio. The honor students went down last summer and investigated that. So that's an opportunity, not this Friday, but the 20th, 7 p.m., Watley Performing Arts Auditorium, an original creative film on Mexican American identity in late 20th century San Antonio. In addition to that, I'm very excited about your research papers that you're working on. And today, we're one of the reasons I'm going to try to sum up everything is we need to deal with a topic that is an important part of Mexican American history. This is the idea of mestizaje. Mestizaje is the Spanish term for miscegenation, mestizaje. And I think this kind of interests some of you in your research papers. So for instance, Alan working on Black conquistadores, trying to compare that, that they have in their skin color a kind of inferior station from the Spanish residue of the Reconquista that we'll talk about in a second. But, what can they make of that? And certainly Maria working on a mestizo relationships between John Rolfe and Pocahontas and between Cortez and La Malinche. So today I think we're kind of working with a lot of you on your research papers. Um, so what I'm trying to get across here today, and I'm going to try to share here something that I hope that you'll find helpful here. This PowerPoint will be on the website as well, so you can refer back to that. So you can see we're looking at mestizaje. And what does that refer to again? Miscegenation. The Spanish provinces are, of course, what we're basically looking at throughout our course. We're looking at if you tilt the United States south rather than east, you have a whole different history, and it's a Spanish history. And so what do we make of this miscegenation, and how are we going to look at this? Well, let's just look at a kind of a brief summary. If we go back to the 16th century, basically when our story starts, we see the great conquistas grandes of the Spanish. Mexico in 1521 by Hernan Cortez, and 1533 by Francisco Pizarro of the Incas. And these are like just great, fantastic events for Spain, that is, because they get totally rich, getting all that Mexican silver and Peruvian gold. I just saw a lot of Peruvian gold, and it's very rare, by the way, because the Spanish melted down so much of their gold into ingots. But our museum, the Dallas Museum of Art, has a tremendous panel of Inca artifacts that are in pure gold. It's very impressive. But anyway, when we were talking about Mexico and Peru, those are conquistas grandes, the great takeovers. And when we talk about racial policy of New Spain, of course, New Spain was governed by a group of viceroys in the Americas that are set up to be direct emissaries of the king, we're talking about a very strong racial system. And one of the points I'd like to try to develop today is that, ironically, uh, in Mexico and Peru, where you have these great conquests, you have this race-based social hierarchy to a much stronger extent than you do actually in the northern provinces. Now, our history is not directly on Mexico itself or Peru, that's for sure, as it is basically centered in Mexican American history, although we're also taking in Spanish Florida and Spanish Puerto Rico. But basically, though Mexico is the birthplace of the cosmic race, of the cosmopolitan race, Mestizaje. It is ironic that actually more mestizaje occurs in the northern provinces, that is, in Texas and Arizona, California, than it does in Spain. And we might ask, why does Spain, when it comes over to the New World, why is it so race-based? Did they have like racial theories like the English and the Americans of the 19th century that, Africans or other people were not descendants of Adam and Eve and that they were maybe like a different species? Not at all. The Spanish that come across in the 16th century are good Roman Catholics that believe that we are all one human family, basically. However, there was, starting with the 10th century, a reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula by the Spanish. Now, at one point, the Muslims had this fantastic kingdom, which almost resembled a tolerant United States of America called El Andalus. From the 14th century, that was its heyday. El Andalus was a Muslim state in Spain. And an interesting thing, it not only gave us the Alhambra, but it wiped out a lot of the Christian heresies that were there before that. And so when we have the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by the little Catholic estates that were left in the north, it's just kind of a miracle thing that they did this. But when we have the Reconquista, the Spanish associate the Moors and the Muslims with darker skin. And so they have this kind of race-based idea that Christians are going to be fair-haired, fair-skinned, and Muslims are going to be darker. And they bring that to the New World. And it is actually, quite striking how fixed this idea is. But again, what I'm arguing is that this is really better realized, ironically, in Peru and Mexico than it is in the northern provinces, where you have a different dynamic. But let's look at this race-based hierarchy here. Right at the top, you have the Peninsulares. They are the Spanish in the New World that are born in Spain. Now, why do they have the top rank? It is because basically the kings of Spain want to extract as much wealth as they can from their new possessions. And they do quite well because they're involved in European politics. The Spanish do some amazing things at the Battle of Malta and Lepanto. They are the decisive force that breaks back the Ottoman Empire, that turns back the Muslims that had, since the 7th century, gone on a rampage of Christendom. So the Spanish need money. They want to extract it from their new countries. And the Peninsulares are their best bet. So they have the top rank in the New World. Under that, we have the Criollos. Number 2, these are pure Spanish blood, but born in the New World. Under that, the Mestizos, mixed Spanish and Indian blood. The Mulattoes are mixed Spanish and African blood, particularly when the Portuguese take over Brazil. You have a mixture between the Portuguese and blacks, and mulattoes have a kind of exalted place in Brazil because there was so much intermarriage on that level there. But there was a lot of mulattoes too in Mexico. The Spanish brought over some 200,000 slaves from Africa, but it was said within one generation, those 200,000 had almost disappeared because many of the Indian women in Mexico were fine with African Americans. And there was a lot of mestizaje right there. So that real Black African development that you do see more in the Caribbean islands. And Mexico, it's kind of diluted right down. The cosmic race is forming. But just to go on with this racial hierarchy, below the mulattoes, you have the Mission Indians. So one way in which Spain reaches out to assimilate other peoples is it has missions run by Jesuits, but then mainly Franciscans in the northern provinces. And the Franciscans will take in Indians, teach them a lot of new stuff, like, how to raise cattle. I mean, Indians didn't know cattle, they just had buffalo. They weren't quite as domesticated. And, they teach them new seeds, new herbs, and of course they have to go to mass. They're kind of like in a compound, basically. But those Indians that did that had a higher scale than just other Indians, who are still living outside the Spanish. And then there were Zambos, that is people who were African, who would come over and would marry, say, an Indian. They're half Black. The Spanish saw them as particularly combustible, although, I mean, combustible in the sense you couldn't trust them very much. But they didn't have a high idea of mestizos either. They thought that mestizos, the mixed Spanish and Indian, were setting a bad example for other Indians in general. And at the lowest end of the totem pole were African Americans. Isn't it interesting how, the Africans, who are a minority of the people of the world, the people always find an easy way to subjugate them when they export them out of their own homeland and form this Black minority that they can take advantage of. Well, that's true too with Spanish America. So the point is that, and you may see this as surprising, and it is, that here you have a race-based hierarchy, and yet it is out of this race-based hierarchy that you're going to have the idea of mestizaje, the mixing, the miscegenation, that's going to occur like a lot in Mexico, but even more in the northern provinces, Florida, Texas, New Mexico, California, Arizona. Now, if we might note that the 16th century is the time when you have these incredible, grandes conquistas for the Spanish, where they get all this money. When it comes time to the northern provinces, things aren't going that well. We can talk about the Florida fiascos, for example. How many times does Spain try to get a hold of Florida? And by the way, they love Florida. And of course, Florida, the name comes from Ponce de Leon, who saw a lot of flowers there. But they really wanted Florida most of all the northern provinces, because that would control the Caribbean. Sugar-rich islands in the Caribbean are like the number one prize for everyone, the French, the English, and the Spanish. Do we know that the English had more ships in the Caribbean during the American Revolution than they had along the eastern coast, because the Caribbean was really important. And we can see that there are a number of Spanish attempts to get Florida that all fail. There's Ponce de Leon in 1521, Lucas Vasquez, who actually tried along the Georgia coast and fails in 1526, Pánfilo de Narvaez, which is one of the worst expeditions ever, that gives us also Cabeza de Vaca, who ends up in Texas and walks all the way home to Mexico. That's in the 1520s. We have the Hernan de Soto trek in 1539 to 43. That also ends up in Texas under his subcommander, de Moscoso, when de Soto gets killed. De Soto had previous experience in Peru and was expecting big things. The northern provinces give us the Coronado disaster, where the great Francisco Coronado goes out with 1,000 Indians and Spaniards into the southwest, and he returns with only about 100. And then we have the Tristan de Luna disaster, too, in 1559 in Pensacola. It's not till the Pedro Menendez feat, taking St. Augustine, that hopefully you watched in our video on that topic, where finally in 1565 the Spanish get St. Augustine. So what's the point here in terms of mestizaje? Well, there's a different dynamic in the northern provinces. In Mexico, the Spain takes over, they conquer, they destroy. It said that the population of Mexico in the 16th century, the Indian population went from 25 million to 1 million. And of course, it's because of smallpox and the measles and mumps and all these European diseases. But basically, there's a kind of subjugation. And the Spanish have this encomienda system, which is kind of like slavery. And then they have the repartimiento, which involves a lot of corvée labor when they try to repent of the slavery. But there's a lot of subordination of one race or group up on against the other. And to be sure, there's a lot of intermarriage from the start. I mean, it's not only La Malinche and Cortez. Cortez gets a little time with Moctezuma, the Aztec leader's daughter and niece. And many of the caciques, the Aztec nobles, had, the conquistadores intermarry with their daughters, etc. But still, what we have in the northern provinces is a much more tenuous hold of the Spaniards over that land during the whole time. They basically got to work with the Indians in a way that they do not need to work with them in Mexico. Basically, with the northern provinces, they're going to be lucky if they have any peninsulares at all, because peninsulares aren't interested in areas that don't have any gold or silver. And that is true of the northern provinces. So because the Spanish dominance is so much less in the northern provinces, the Spanish are going to be a lot more desperate, and they're not going to be able to have these great racial categories. Okay, so the 16th century is a time of the great conquests of Peru and Mexico by the Spanish, but also a lot of fiascos and debacles that we see, just trying to take over Florida. Well, when we move to the 17th century, and I know we were really concentrating this week on the 18th century, but hopefully this is a kind of good summary backdrop. When we move to the 17th century, we note that Florida is in its golden age, as far as Spanish Florida is concerned. This is the time when we have the ongoing success of the Menendez colony of St. Augustine. We also have successful Spanish missions to the Appalachee, a numerous group in the northern part, the Timucua, and the Wali, who are more around the St. Augustine area. So things are flourishing there. And because we have a lot of Spanish soldiers in the presidios, the forts there, and a lot of Indian women in these missions, there's a lot of crossing over there. We note that in New Mexico is not quite so good. We have the Pueblo Revolt in 1688 under Pope, and hopefully you remember that video on that. Also, Arizona and Texas are just getting started in the 17th century. Father Eustasio Kino gets started in southern Arizona, an area at that time that was called Primavera Alta. And then we have Texas just getting started really in the 1680s and 90s. So not much going on there. What we're going to be concentrating today is, of course, the 18th century. And the 18th century is a good time to examine Texas. Why? Because this golden age of Spanish Florida passes away. Why in 1763 does Spain actually give this valuable province of Florida to Great Britain? Well, there's an interesting story there. To remain tenable, the Spanish governors of Florida began inviting in escaped runaway African Americans and even putting them up from the English colonists who had a lot of slaves in the Carolinas and Georgia by 1730 under James Oglethorpe. And this really ticked off the English colonists. It's interesting that these Africans that were invited into Florida and were given refuge there, intermarried a lot with a Creek breakaway tribe known as the Seminoles. But there was a lot of mestizaje between these African Americans and the Spanish and the Mission Indians. So actually, mestizaje was a way to unite Florida against the English, the anger of the English. Now, that did not last forever because after 1740, the English colonists are really raiding deep into Florida, and they're just ripping up the vineyards of what was good about Spanish Florida. This is why Spain didn't really have any trouble giving it to Great Britain in 1763. Well, what kind of happens is Great Britain comes in with their colonists, a bunch of loyalists basically that don't like the American revolutionaries too much, but also they get rid of pretty much what was there of Spanish Florida. A lot of those people go to Cuba, and it's true that Spain gets 1783, it gets Florida back, but it never really invests in it after that. The great hold of Florida, which is before California of the 19th century, California will become a great Spanish province in the 19th century, way better than Texas. Nevertheless, Florida had its heyday, but it's not the 18th century, thanks to this effort to get Africans down there as a kind of buffer against the English, which doesn't work. We know that the 18th century is not a great time either for New Mexico because we have a kind of uneasiness between the Pueblo, who revolted 1680 to 1688, and the Franciscan, which goes on into the 18th century. We do have Arizona being settled fairly nicely, in the southern part at least. But there is the Pima Revolt in 1751. So New Mexico and Arizona both give us the specter of major Indian revolts that we do not have in Texas or will not have in California or even Florida. And this indicates the more tenuous nature, again, of Spanish control, greater primacy being given to the Indians of these areas. So this is why we're going to try to focus our spotlight here on Texas, because this is, I won't say a golden age. Spanish Texas only gets up to 4,000 people that can properly be called Spanish. There's a lot of other people there, but they're not really listening to Spain in the 18th century. But if there's a good time for Spanish Texas, it is the 18th century. Of course, what we mean by New Spain, if you can see that map there on the right with the gray, that really was Tejas as far as the Spanish were concerned in the 18th century. So in studying the 18th century, we're really studying the best time to study Texas, which is a very solid backbone of Mexican-American history, because this is true Mexican as opposed, say, to Florida. So just a little backdrop again on Texas, for example. Actually, it was already in the 16th century when the Spanish knew about Texas. Alonso Alvarez, kind of illicit insomniac, spotted Texas for the first time in 1519. He didn't see many Indians there, which is kind of interesting. Actually, if we want to talk about, what is today Texas, there are settlements earlier than what I'm about to talk about in eastern Texas. But this really resulted from the retreat of the Spanish from the Pueblo Revolt. So El Paso can really be seen as a kind of tributary of the New Mexico settlement of Juan Oñate that goes way back to the late 16th century. Why, again, does New Mexico get a lot of early settlement? Well, they thought there was precious metals there that they never find in Texas, and so they're not very excited about Texas. But in any case, we're concentrating here on the formation of Spanish Texas. And we're going to have to go back to 1690, so just 10 years before our halo to 18th century here, looking at the El Cid of Texas. Alonso de Leon, that is, who was the governor of Coahuila, a northern Mexican province. Now, when we look at the kind of leaders that come in to Texas, we could maybe just easily equate them with, I mentioned El Cid, who was a legendary Spanish figure of the Reconquista against the Moors, kind of El Cid antitypes, El Cid type people like Cortez and Pizarro, just turn this heathen land into Roman Catholicism like overnight. But that's kind of misleading. What we see in Texas are not really conquests. They are known as entradas. And basically, what the Spaniards do is they just kind of march into Texas and they sort of announce not really domination, but hegemony. By hegemony, we mean that everyone kind of acknowledges the Spanish have a kind of cultural leadership. They have the know-how between their Spanish steel, the Toledo steel, their stockpile of horses, their arquebus, that is, they got firearms. They acknowledge them as a leader, but hegemony is different than domination. Hegemony means that people acknowledge you and they maybe trade with you, but they don't really follow you. They don't really feel like they're, totally under the domination of you. And so when we talk about entradas, we're talking about much more uneasy Spanish control. And it's amazing that Spain will have a kind of uneasy control of Texas for like as much as 300 years. Virtually no soldiers there, but they have this uneasy control. But when we talk about entradas, and when we talk about that with mestizaje, we're talking about because the Spanish are going to be more desperate just to have any kind of control, there's going to be a lot more openness to mestizaje with Indians, especially Mission Indians, the kind of Spaniards that they send to Texas to head the presidios, that is the Spanish forts. Sometimes they are like convicts that people have had a record. I mean, Spain is so desperate to get people in Texas. I mean, Jose Escandon, who colonizes the Rio Grande Valley, actually he's the star of the show in the 1740s. He basically does it because he pays people to come here, and he doesn't care, if they're, just mestizo or criollo. He just wants people because he's kind of basically a real estate dealer. But anyway, let's go look at the first of these great Spanish entradas that establish a hegemony, but which also leave the door wide open for this mestizaje, this mixing that is more a part of the provinces even than Mexico. So we're talking about a governor of Coahuila, Alonso de Leon, who is a kind of 17th century martial arts fanatic. Amazing. He actually, kept himself in great shape. He was a devout man. He basically wants to spread Roman Catholicism, unlike some of the people that we are going to talk about. He gets 1,000 horses together from Coahuila, 175 men, 400 cattle, and rides into this great foray into our great state in 1690. He does have a problem with the Carunqua Indians. The Carunqua Indians were around current-day Houston. They were noted for smearing this alligator grease among them. He does have a brief skirmish with them. He beats them handily. The Carunquas actually had seized a few Frenchmen of the La Salle expedition. Just as we talk about the French trying to gain control of Florida, so with Ferdinand La Salle in the 1680s, the French had tried to grab Texas, and that's one of the reasons for the Alonso de Leon. Just like Pedro Menendez comes in to take out the French, Alonso de Leon was making sure the French weren't there. He does ransom a few French children from the Carunqua Indians, beats the Carunquas. But that isn't really, like he's dominating the Carunquas. The Carunquas still live on. He just sort of beats them back. And that's about the only military action he has. He has a legendary encounter with the Caddo, who basically are wowed by this guy. And from this, we have a myth that there is a Spanish woman um, who was in a convent, Maria de Agreda, and she had all kinds of mystical revelations. She actually wrote a multi-volume history of the Virgin Mary that she said she got from direct revelation. Maria de Agreda, who was always in Spain, uh, at least according to our modern historical analysis, nevertheless had visions that she was also appearing in Texas. And according to the Alonso de Leon tradition, Indians were doing obeisance to a blue virgin, who they identified then with Maria de Agreda. And this was even said to have caused the blue bonnets. But anyway, Alonso de Leon is filled with hope that the Caddo can come in line and be good Spaniards. But there's going to be like one major difference between the Indians of Texas, even Eastern Texas, like the Caddo, who had the best chance for being Spanish civilized. The Caddo, incidentally, are pretty much farmers. They developed a three-sister agriculture that is of corn, squash, and beans. They're in our area. They give us a lot of pots that we have in Northeast Texas Library. We've got actually another reason to come on the 20th of February is you can see the Caddo pots in our library. We've got the largest public collection of pots, and there's reason for that. If you want to ask me about it, I'll tell you sometime. But any case, it's kind of a secret, actually. So I have to tell you person to person about that, why NTCC has the largest collection of Caddo pots. But anyway, the Caddo seem to be good prospects. But there's one thing about the Caddo that differentiate them from the Appalachia of Florida or various Californian Indians, and that is the Caddo can always kind of thumb their noses at the Spanish because they can deal with the French of Louisiana. And this is another problem with hegemony in Spain. You know, you're just getting this fundamental sense of recognition because the Caddo can always play off the French against the Spanish. And this makes the Indians worth more to the Spanish. It makes for better conditions for Mestizaje. You're kind of lucky what you can get if you can get any Indians in your mission in Texas. And unlike the missions in Florida and California, the Texas missions are like a joke almost. Although they do get some, and they do get some Caddo around the Nacogdoches area, thanks, first of all, to Alonso de Leon, who sets up a mission there. Alonso de Leon, though, despite all his good exercise and comes back, he just dies a few months after the expedition. But he's immediately followed up by Domingo Terán de los Rios in 1691. De los Rios is actually the first Texas governor. He was more of a functionary, whereas Alonso de Leon knew the area a little bit more because he was from Coahuila, the northern Mexico province. Domingo Terán had seen the great riches of Peru, and he thought that Alonso de Leon was a spendthrift and total, ignorant loco bumbler. He wasn't anything like didn't have anything like the piety of Alonso de Leon. He was just going to come up here. He was going to find gold and silver, just like the way did in Peru. And he's so contemptuous of the whole thing, Domingo Terán de los Rios, is that he only has 50 soldiers and 100 horses because, he's a Peruvian and he's a, lifelong soldier, diplomat of the Spanish. He can do anything. And these dumb Texas Indians are not going to, be much of a problem. And he comes up north of the Rio Grande. One weird thing about Domingo Terán de los Rios, so he wants to rename everything. And he comes up with these kind of dumb names. Like he wanted to call the Rio Grande the River of the North. And then he wanted to name the other rivers of Texas after things like River of the Pines, River of the Birds, River of the Deer. We have these things throughout Texas. You can't really distinguish the rivers on this basis. And he crosses the Rio Grande, and immediately, you have that chaparral country of South Texas, which is pretty hard, and that's why you have the Cuiltican Indians, who are kind of like the ghetto. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, but they're kind of the lower class Indians of Texas. And he's getting all kind of chiggers and mosquitoes and ticks on his horses. Um, and they're running out of water. In fact, they're like ready to go blind. And they get to the Nueces River just in time. The Nueces is where Corpus Christi is today. And they go, water, agua, agua, agua. But they get there and the Nueces is blocked up, backed up because there's a drought and it's just salt. So they almost go mad, but they found some springs, luckily, that saves their lives. They make it to the Nacogdoches mission of the Franciscans that Alonso de Leon had set up. But rather than being the rescuer of this mission, like the Franciscan priest thought, he actually just like raids his own mission because Domingo y Terán is not devout at all, and he takes their horses. And then he tries to impress the Caddo, who have already stolen some mission horses and aren't all that impressed at all. They're just sort of incredulous, kind of looking at him. And Domingo Terán de los Rios does a lot of other stupid things, like trying to go up. It's December and the Red River, it's actually getting icy, and he actually falls in and almost dies of hypothermia. At this point, he's just like enraged about this godforsaken country. You got to remember the one Domingo Terán de los Rios quote about Texas. He says, no sane person has ever seen a worse province. He said that the roads of Texas must have been designed by some sleepwalker. He hated Texas. And his curses, when he does eventually make it back, but here is this governor of Texas discouraging everyone from going there. But that is going to, again, help the course of Mestizaje, because you're not going to have a strong Spanish concentration in Texas. I said there are only 4,000 of them and their mission Indians by 1800. That's not very many, 4,000. Florida had 5 times that much in the 17th century. So, thanks to Domingo Terán de los Rios. But the role for Mestizaje is big because he's going to keep the Spanish part of Texas underpopulated. That means more reliance on mestizos, more reliance on mission Indians, more reliance even on the non-mission Indians to try to get along with them, like the Caddo, who can thumb their nose and play off the French against them. Domingo Terán de los Rios is really a blustering loser. He's humbled by Texas, but he plays his role in our story of Mestizaje. Now, it takes another devout criollo from Coelho, not a peninsulare like the arrogant Domingo Terán de los Rios, but a criollo like Domingo Ramon to come up here to again assert Spanish hegemony in a big way. Domingo Ramon, by the way, is the son of Diego Ramon, who also crossed into Texas a little bit from a Rio Grande fortress that they had, San Juan Bautista, which is kind of a point of embarkation into Texas. Diego Ramon, though, was interesting because of his sexual proclivities. He, mission Indians, mestizos, that didn't bother him. And Domingo was probably a illegitimate son, although Domingo's a lot more pious than his father, and tries to get the Franciscans back up in forth in Nacogdoches again. And Domingo Ramon, who has 100 soldiers rather than 50, goes all the way up and establishes Los Adayes, which today is in Louisiana, as a great Spanish presidio of Texas. Los Adayes, even for a while, is the capital of Spanish Texas, although the Spanish can barely afford a few soldiers there. But this is a great Spanish entrada, the one of Domingo Ramon. Unfortunately, though, just as we have the great Alonso de Leon entrada that is mirrored by Domingo Terán de los Rios, so we have someone who's kind of excited by the Domingo Ramon entrada, who tries to piggyback on it, but doesn't do quite as well. And this is Martín de Alarcón. Martin de Alarcon, again, is a Peninsulari. Again, you get the whiff that he's kind of arrogant, not so pious. He's fought with the Royal Spanish Navy. Martin de Alarcon is remembered finally today because he started the Alamo, the great mission at San Antonio. But Alarcon, when he comes up to Nacogdoches, doesn't like the fact that basically for survival there, the missions had been trading with the French. And he confiscates 24 pairs of blue stockings, 170 pieces of fine lace, and rich brocades, much to the consternation of the Mission Indians in Nacogdoches. Basically, de Alarcon discourages any settlement north of San Antonio. And when we talk about 18th century Texas, we're just talking about really three centers. San Antonio de Bejar, which is roughly terminus to San Antonio today. La Bahia, which is near Victoria, Texas today, to the east. And then Nacogdoches. And Martin de Alarcon really discourages the Franciscans that were in Nacogdoches because, he pretty much raids them, just the way Domingo y Terán did. And what happens after this terrible disenchantment of Northeast Texas by Martin de Alarcon is we have the famed Chicken War of 1719, when the Spanish showed how much they really valued Tejas de Noreste, our wonderful Northeast Texas, with our green pastures and quiet waters, wonderful Northeast Texas, right? How many soldiers did the Spanish leave to defend our beautiful homeland of Northeast Texas, which I'll define as a beautiful area of school and church towns, nothing too big, between the Red River and the Sabine River. They left one soldier in the so-called Chicken War of 1719. And yet there's kind of a miracle about the 1719 war. It's called the Chicken War. Why would they call it the Chicken War? It's when the French under Philippe Blondel attacked Los Adais. There was only one Spanish soldier to defend Northeast Texas. But when he raided the henhouse at Los Adais, the loyal chickens that later on will give us our great prosperity when Bo Pilgrim, rises to be #1 pilgrim master of the world in 2005. But our chickens and them were patriotic also, and they caused Blondel's horse to kick up and throw him off when he was trying to rate. He attached these chickens to his saddle, and that led a very perceptive Spaniard to run, get on a horse, and tell the missions to evacuate, that the French were coming. Well, they were just coming with a minuscule army and actually never made it to Nacogdoches. But one point of the Chicken War, again, is to say we're talking about like really small numbers. And when we talk about the Spanish trying to get a beachhead in Texas, their numbers are so small that all these racial categories are just going to go by the wayside. I mean, if you can get Mission Indians on your side, if you can get any Indians on your side, this was a chance for Indians to kind of go up the hierarchy if they wanted a kind of wealth. If they wanted to not starve or have a better chance of not starving, you could work your way up and join up with the Spanish. So Spanish then, though, are really languishing. It looks like they may just pass from existence. And they might have, if it hadn't been for the great entrada of Miguel de Aguayo. This is, besides Jose Escandon's, if you call that an entrada, and Jose Escandon just stuck around the Rio Grande, basically. But Miguel Aguayo is really the last of the great entradas. He was from Coahuila, and again, a kind of governor. This guy takes 500 soldiers, 2,800 horses, 4,800 head of cattle, 6,400 sheep, and goes all the way up to Los Adais. Doesn't really fight anybody, just has a tremendous march. And of course, he's the one that gives us a lot of longhorn cattle that Makes Texas famous for its cattle later on. Um, Great Miguel Aguayo built the most wondrous mission of San Antonio, which is not the Alamo by a long shot, but the Mission de uh, San Miguel de Aguayo, named after him. And if you look at the banner of our course blackboard shell, you'll see like this blue dome. And that is part of that mission that is still there in San Antonio today. The most beautiful of the missions. It's built beautifully, a stone fort, big area. You can really gain some respect, really, for Spain only if you go to San Antonio today, which was really the big enduring center. But in any case, um, Miguel Aguayo is very important for reasserting the Spanish hegemony, making Spanish Texas's best time in the 18th century. This Lion of Coahuila coming up north and establishing this hegemony. Aguayo's important for another reason too. It's amazing that after he does this, that just like 10 years after, he's only got like 144 soldiers left in Texas to defend all of Texas against the inroads of the French. But another thing that Aguayo does is he invites the Canary Islanders to Spanish Texas. Now, if you're going to study Spanish Texas, the Canary Islanders are a huge deal. We are not talking about many people again. I mean, they're kind of like the pilgrims that landed in Plymouth in 1620 for the English. Just a very small group, but an incredibly influential group. In 1731, thanks to the call of Miguel de Aguayo, who tried to get the Spanish to do something for once, for him. In 1731, some 56 Canary Islanders come. Now, this is actually an island in the Atlantic that Spain had subdued. The people that went to the Canary Island were not really good peninsulares because they were from the Canary Islands. They were a Spanish frontier that had already intermarried with some of the islanders there. But they would be regarded as good for Texas because they were running out of land in the Canary Islands. And they were good frontiers people. So they were welcome with open arms to Texas. And we actually get 56 of them coming in 15 families, 56 Canary Islanders in 1731, thanks to Miguel Aguayo. That's all we're talking about, 56. It's notable, though, that when the Canary Islanders start coming to Texas, that some of their numbers start intermarrying with people they find along the way. So they only began as like 11 families, but they're up to 15 by the time they make it to Texas. But these people who are not true peninsulares, of course, they'll act like peninsulares if they can get away with it. But again, they are such an embattled little clan that they're not going to act like current day clans and tribes in Pakistan, which, are so notorious. They always intermarry, like they'll marry their cousins. There's a lot of birth defects, in fact, today in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan because there's so much intermarriage among Muslim tribal groups that it causes a lot of birth defects. The Canary Islanders are not like that. They are conscious of themselves for a few centuries in Texas history, but they have to marry outward. They don't marry inward. And so this is, again, good for the cause of Mestizaje, because you got a peninsulary group, or not a quasi-peninsulary group, not really. They've already been intermarried. And so they're much more open to intermarriage, miscegenation. And they will also get into the cattle trade. And that's important. It turns out if there's anything that economically works, it's not subsistence farming so much for the Spanish in Texas, but it is really the rancherias, the ranches. And they learn how, you can't ship food to a city very well, but you can run cattle. So the whole thing with the cowboy culture, the vaquero culture, is really Spanish in origin. And all the things that the cowboys later use in our famous Westerns. And in the 20th century, about a third of all films in America were cowboy films. Isn't that interesting? Westerns were so important because Americans fixated on the idea of the cowboy as a symbol of American individualism against Nazi Germany and uh, communism and so forth. Just America was just obsessed with cowboys. Well, it's all a vaquero tradition, and the whole idea of the wide-brimmed hat, the chaparros, the rodeos, everything goes back to the vaquero. But that was also Canary Islander stuff. And the vaqueros, the whole cattle culture, which is big in 18th century Spanish Texas, about the only good economic thing that got going. That also is where you get a lot of mestizaje and a lot of arguments today about who really gave us that cowboy culture in America. Now, of course, the Spanish will say, well, we did it. But then again, it was the Canary Islanders that basically got into it and dominated it. So kind of quasi-Spanish. But the ranches of the Canary Islanders had a lot of mission Indians that would do this. And they had a lot of Africans as well. And today you have the claim that the true vaquero culture of South Texas, you have a claim of African Americans who say, why do cowboys go, yeah, why do they make all these noises and sing? And well, a lot of that tradition is from African, because the Africans were cattle raisers. And Indians will say, no, we were the ones that shouted. And we were the ones, were so colorful. And we were the ones that loved riding horses. So we were the ones who gave the vaquero culture. And that was because it was a very polyglot, mixed cattle culture in Texas, Spanish Texas, which gives us even more. What's that word again? Mestizaje. So what the Canary Islanders represent here is a sort of hybridization of Spanish to begin with, but that leads to more hybridization, more mestizaje, more miscegenation. Interesting case of the provinces giving us even more cosmic racism or more cosmopolitan mixing than we would think of even in the case of Mexico. And I'm getting here to the close, so I hope you've been bearing with me here. But I want to talk about just a few other kind of examples of this. I said that the three great places to be, if you can call it that, in Spanish Texas, was either Nacogdoches or La Bahia, but especially San Antonio de Bejar. And but there was another place for a brief time in the 1740s and 1750s. And this was a Spanish mission, San Xavier, east of Austin, around where today Rockport is. And so there were missions there, and there was also a presidio that was for a while led by the notorious Felipe Rabago y Terán. Felipe Rabago y Terán. We don't know really if he was a Peninsulari or a Criollo. He certainly acted like he was a Peninsulari. And he did have some pull with King Ferdinand of Spain. So we think he does have, some kind of Spanish family influence. So he gets to be, commander. And, as far as the Peninsulari claim in Texas, you're not going to go much lower than that. Any sub-commanders are not going to be Peninsulari. But anyway, so you got a guy who's at least acting like it's a Peninsulari, who is, of course, Felipe Rabago y Terán. Well, he's got to try to recruit people for his presidio. And one of the person he recruits is this tailor from San Antonio by the name of Juan Jose Ceballos. And while he's taking up this, kind of just whoever he can get, mission Indians, he doesn't care. He's bringing up to this presidio in San Xavier. It turns out that Juan Ceballos has a very attractive wife. And Felipe Rabago, who sees a dearth of women available prospects, begins fooling around with Ceballos' wife. And when Ceballos, kind of lights into him and tells him he's not going to tolerate this, the notorious Felipe Rabago puts Ceballos in prison. And that's not it. Uh, but he actually makes love to Ceballos' wife, it's said, while Ceballos is in prison, just to kind of totally humiliate this guy. So this is sort of like this Peninsulare would be humiliating a Criollo mestizo, basically. But then it turns out that this Presidio becomes kind of like a free love commune or something, because and the Franciscans, who also have a mission in San Xavier, are really scandalized. The Spanish soldiers he gets don't have any women around, so they attract the mission Indians away from the mission, to clean for them. But then they become like concubines, and the Franciscan missionaries are like askance about this. Interesting, in New Mexico, the Franciscan missionaries get the upper hand from secular authorities, but this isn't the case in Texas. The Franciscans complain, and Rubigo just looks the other way. So what you basically got at this Presidio in the 1750s is this dissolute Felipe Rabigo and his soldiers just having all this sex with all these mission Indians. And like, it's just totally breaking down. It's forming a cosmic race anyway, but not on good terms. Well, there are so many complaints that come into the mission that the head of the mission decides to excommunicate Rabigo. And this really gets Felipe Rabigo upset. And he probably, we don't really know who did this, but somehow there's a murder one night of Father Gonzabal and also Senor Cabellos, who had escaped to the mission. One got shot through the skull with an arrow. The other was hit with a bullet, Gonzabal. So 2 clear murders. And for a while, can you believe it, that our friend Rabigo gets away with this? But finally, when this occurs, the stories just get too, overblown, and the governor does remove him, and he's got to kind of go to Monclova for a while and answer some big questions. And Rabigo seems to kind of repent at this time of what he had done. Later on, he'll be knighted. But one of the reasons is, too, that he will try to go out on various ventures, no longer to the San Xavier mission, which closes down the Presidios there, but to the Lipan Apaches in West Texas, where he tries to missionize them. Rob, this is an important part of our chapter here on Mestizaje, because we're seeing here that we've got mixing going on here, a lot of mixing. So the Rabigo story, a good case for our story here of Spanish Texas. Now we can go on here and talk about another case with Gil Ibarbo, who was a descendant of Los Adais people. One interesting thing about him is that he settled Nacogdoches resolutely. He was also known as a smuggler. The Spanish wanted to give up on Nacogdoches again and again and again. But Ibarbo, who was of Basque origin, a special ethnic group within Spain, settled it nevertheless. And again, though, you got this desperate Spanish settlement that will intermarry anything to stay alive. Missions are generally not successful in Spanish Texas by the end of the 18th century. Even the famous Alamo mission goes secular. One Spanish official goes across Texas, 1765, the Marquis de Ruby, and says that Texas is a great waste of money. He wants to scale back to San Antonio at least, which is very disheartening for the Nacogdoches people. But we should note, too, that and I don't know that I have a slide here. Maybe I don't. But let's see. I guess oh, here it is. Um, when we talk about West Texas, um, we've got to put a big asterisk about Spanish hegemony because there was a certain tribe there. Do you know the name of it? That just behaves unlike any other Indian tribe. They are the ones that stopped the Spanish Empire in their tracks after 500 years of expansion, and they are um, the Comanche. The Comanche are the ones that adopt the Spanish horse. They basically make this god dog, as they call it, into their god, and they just master horses from day one. They become one of the most elite cavalry units of anywhere in the world. They can live off their horses. Of course, each Comanche brave has like about 13 horses that they drive, and then they switch off, so they go from one to another. But the Comanche that cannot be pinned down, that are just incredible fighters, they do not allow for Spanish hegemony in West Texas. They are the ones that defeat the Spanish Texas at the San Saba mission in the 1750s. They kind of erase it like a computer, like you would a computer file. And when Padres Ortilla goes after them, they vanquish Ortilla, and the biggest defeat that the Spanish Empire will ever suffer in the New World along the Red River. So the Spanish are lucky if they can buy off the Comanche. And we should note that, no area do the Spanish have such a setback as they do in West Texas. But the importance of our story is that when we're later going to have a Mexican Revolution to gain independence from Spain from 1820 to 1830, it's basically going to be mestizos and criollos, with a bunch of mulattoes, against the criollos and peninsulares. And how does that work? Well, a lot of the peninsulares can command Mission Indians, so it's kind of a trade-off. It's a terrible war. It takes like 10 years to fight the Mexican War for Independence. How will Texas, which side will Spanish Texas will be? We're so mestizoized, we're so mestizajeized that we, of course, will fight for the Republican that won independence from Mexico against Spain. And this will lead, however, to the worst battle ever that we know about in Texas history, the Battle of Medina, 1513, where you can believe it. Now, we're talking about 4,000 Spanish Texans. 1,500 Republicans get vanquished about in this battle. It's a terrible blow, awful for Spanish Texas, never recover from it. In 1813, the worst battle we know of Texas history, some 2,500 people and all died. But it's a victory for the Royalists. It's a victory for the Peninsulares coming into Texas, not for the mestizo type people that were already here. So it's a huge setback. But I mention this because, at the end of our story, we really have cosmic Texas. And so, like with the Spanish mixing up with the Indians of Florida, later on with California, we see, ironically, in the northern provinces, a lot of mestizaje, a lot of miscegenation. An important argument that can be made about Hispanics today is that they promote miscegenation in the United States. 27% of Hispanics intermarry when they get married. Whites do more and more, probably because of the Hispanics. 42% of intermarriages in America are white and Hispanic. Whites used to only intermarry about 4% as late as the 1980s. Now, about 14% of whites intermarry. The whole idea of racism in America is going out the window as Hispanics become more numerous. So why are we looking at mestizaje? Why, especially in the northern Spanish provinces? Because this is what we're going to have guiding us into the modern United States and our decline of racism. So this is the importance of studying Mexican-American history, and I hope you've found this episode interesting today. A lot longer than my other announcements, I know, but hopefully we're kind of bringing the course together today a little bit. So I thank you for bearing with me if you've indeed been able to do that. And we will hopefully see you again. I'm so glad you're keeping up with the discussion uh, entries and also the quizzes. And of course, we got a test next week again, fifth week test. So glad you're hanging in there and always correspond with me if you have any questions. We'll talk to you later.